Welcome once again to yet another in the long ongoing series of So and So Knew, all showing contemporaries who knew that Edward de Vere was using the pseudonym William Shakespeare. This one is called Thomas Bancroft Knew, and I really wish I had a nice portrait of Thomas Bancroft to show you, but I don't think one exists. Instead, I'm going to show you two of his title pages. The Glutton's Fever, a rather moralistic book about his own gluttony and complaining about that, published in 1633, and another moralistic book, two books of epigrams and epitaphs, published in 1639. Both of these books contain a reference to Shakespeare, and if you're very sharp-eyed, you'll notice something the same about these two references to Shakespeare. They both contain in the line immediately above them a reference to Apollo. Apollo's and Shakespeare's in the first one, and Phoebus. Remember, Phoebus is the same as Apollo. Phoebus is a nickname for Apollo, with particular reference to him as god of the sun. And so in the second one you have Phoebus and Shakespeare. In the first you have Apollo's and Shakespeare's on connected lines. Now, those of you who have been watching and I hope enjoying the presentations I've been putting online will see many instances in which Oxford was referred to as Phoebus Apollo, and below there you can see I've got quite a long list of very distinguished contemporaries, all of whom associated Oxford with Phoebus Apollo, and so it was a well-known fact during his lifetime. If anyone went up to a learned person in the street and said, you know, who's most associated with Phoebus Apollo, they would say it is the poet, the concealed poet and playwright, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Right, let's have a look at the first of these two, which is The Glutton's Fever. It comes in the dedication to Woolston Dixie, who was a merchant, much later became Lord Mayor of London. And it's in poetic form, and it goes off blah, 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 blah about poetry in general. And then he says, but the chaste bay not every songster wears. Now, the songster is a poet, so in other words, not every poet can be rewarded for his chastity, his purity, his decency in matters of sexual continence. But the chaste bay not every songster wears, nor of Apollo's sons prove all his heirs. In other words, amongst Apollo's sons, not all of them are his legitimate heirs. Now, those of you who have seen a presentation I put online called John Weaver Knew will instantly recognize, rather coincidentally here, Weaver's epigram, which begins, honey-tongued Shakespeare, when I saw thine issue, I saw Apollo got them and none other. So once again, we've got Apollo and Shakespeare's name put very closely together and a big question mark about the legitimacy of their heirs, of their children. This, of course, is a reference to Edward de Vere, who persuaded his mistress, Penelope Rich, to go to bed with his great friend, the much younger man, Henry Roseley, Earl of Southampton, and to conceive for him an heir to the earldom of Oxford. This was a nifty piece of surrogacy that ended in a terrific scandal. Those titles I've put underneath those portraits on the page you're looking at, these are all titles of presentations I've made, and if you haven't seen them, I really urge you to do so, because what they're showing is all the contemporaries who knew exactly what I've just told you to be the case. And this great scandal was all being written about by people in that day, and that's how we know about it. Do catch up on those if you haven't seen them, because they serve to corroborate everything I'm saying now. Okay, but the chaste bay not every songster wears, nor of Apollo's sons prove all his heirs. In other words, Apollo's got some bastard children. How are we connecting this pretty obvious reference to Edward de Vere as Apollo and his bastard heirs to Shakespeare? Well, it's done in a number of ways. First of all, you can see a colon just after the word heirs. And a colon, as we all know, is used between clauses when the second explains, illustrates, paraphrases, or expands on the first. So that colon is telling you that the sentence about Apollo's bastard children has something to do with what follows. 'Tis not for all to reach at Shakespeare's height. Actually, there's another clue that we're connecting Shakespeare to Apollo there when we talk of Shakespeare's height. And that is, of course, to do with the height of Apollo. He's known as Altus Apollo, High Apollo. If you read Virgil, he's called High Apollo, or by Seneca, High Apollo. And he was represented, as Pliny and others record, in statues of enormous height. There was a statue of Apollo in the Capitol in Rome that was 31 cubits high, and one in the library of the Temple of Augustus, which was known as the Apollo of Tuscany, and that was 50 foot high. There was another built by Nero, a statue of Apollo that was 100 feet high. So when you're linking Apollo's sons and his bastardy here, it is not for all to reach at Shakespeare's height. You're clearly indicating that Shakespeare is the Apollo that you're talking about, i.e. Edward de Vere. I think there's also possible that there is here a sexual innuendo. Height can mean the peak of passion, if you like. I don't want to be too vulgar about it, but obviously it can mean orgasm and things in those days. The reason I say this is not just to add a sort of bit of pepper to an otherwise bland presentation. It's because Edward de Vere is involved in this sexual scandal, and as you're going to see, there's a sexual scandal in the next reference. I've numbered these words from the beginning of the sentence so that you can see that the line that talks about Shakespeare begins on the 17th word, and if you count the lines down, then you won't be surprised to find that it's the 17th line. And time and time again, if you've seen the presentations I've been putting up, we see contemporaries alluding to Shakespeare by the number 17, and that's obviously because it's an allusion to the 17th Earl of Oxford. So there you see he does that twice there. He uses the colon, he uses Apollo, and he's talking about bastardy. So we've got multiple reasons here to understand that Shakespeare is Apollo, and all you need to know is Apollo is Edward de Vere, who's number 17, and you've cracked it. Okay, let's have a look at the second reference, the 1639 reference to Shakespeare. So once again, there it is. It's an epigram, and if you've seen my presentations called Thomas Porter New and John Weaver New, you'll know the importance of linking epigrams one to the other. So that brings us back to this another rude swipe at Phoebus Apollo just above the word Shakespeare. I will come back to the meaning of that in due course. Let's first, however, look at what he's actually saying about Shakespeare in Sonnet 118. Actually, before I go there, I would like to say that this title is odd. It won't appear as odd to you, to Shakespeare. Why is that odd? Well, if you read the book from its beginning and take all the titles of all the things that are written to people, up to and including the page on which Shakespeare occurs, now you can see at a glance why to Shakespeare, which appears here third from the bottom, why it's odd. All the others give Christian name and or title to Sir Charles Shirley, Baronet, for instance. You know, even when you haven't got a Christian name, you've got to Master Farnaby or to Master Pestle of Packington, and everyone else to John Fretchville, Esquire, to Sir Philip Sidney, to Ben Jonson. So to Shakespeare is very empty and very bald, and I think what he's doing is giving you a little clue that there's a problem with the name Shakespeare, and of course we all know what that is. It's only a pseudonym, it's not the proper identity of the person he's addressing in this epigram. The only other epigram with a slightly weird title, which you can see in this list, is of course the one immediately above, and this is the one that I've already hinted to you contains a hint about Oxford as Phoebus. So I'll come to why that is an odd name, to THCH, presently. Okay, let's just quickly read this epigram. To Shakespeare, thy muse's sugared dainties seem to us like the famed apples of old Tantalus. For we, admiring, see and hear thy strains, but none I see or hear those sweets attains. And I'll go on because the next two-liner is addressed to the same, i.e. to Shakespeare. Thou hast so used thy pen, or shook thy spear, that poets startle, nor thy wit come near. Now, I think many of you will remember that I explained in another presentation that the word admire means to astonish, or to startle indeed. So in two consecutive epigrams to Shakespeare, you've got the idea of people being astonished or startled. We i.e. the poets, admiring, or the poets startle. So other poets writing about Shakespeare are astonished. There's something weird about Shakespeare that makes the poets not go near him. I'm skipping over, for obvious reasons, what the surface meaning of these is. It's really too obvious. It's just saying that Shakespeare's a brilliant poet and no other poets can beat them. That goes without saying. What we're always looking at here is the secondary meaning that's underneath it. I don't think you need to own the 3-volume Dictionary of Sexual Language and Imagery in Shakespeare and Stuart Literature, or Shakespeare's Bawdy, there's another book, or Glossary of Shakespeare's Sexual Languages. You don't need any of these to sense that there are quite a lot of phrases and words here with a bawdy sexual undertone to them. Sugared dainties. Dainties are what inspire lust, and actually you can find countless books of preachers preaching against lust who say things like, "And thou shalt ever after loathe the sugared cakes and bewitching dainties of lustful affections," or "amidst thy dainties thy chastity is in danger. Hunger seeketh food, but lust dainties and quails." In other words, dainties are what inspire lust, and you remember that Shakespeare spent a lot of time persuading Henry Roseley, Earl of Southampton, to go to bed with Penelope Rich in rather lustful verse. Venus and Adonis, of course, the sonnets, etc. Apples of old Tantalus. Well, you can find lots of dirty meanings in the Renaissance for apples. Apples, of course, are the great symbol of forbidden fruit in the Bible, and the Garden of Hesperides. And here, of course, we have Tantalus, who's desperately tantalized by apples, wants to grab them. "Hear thy strains." I hardly need to explain to you why that has a sexual overtone. Sweets attains ditto. In the second little epigram, thy pen. Well, if you look up pen in all these glossaries I'm talking about, you'll find it constantly is used to mean penis. But also, of course, here, pen is the nickname for Penelope, the shortening of Penelope. "Thou hast so used thy pen." Remember that Edward de Vere got her to surrogate an heir for him. Or "shook thy spear." Again, to shake can mean to copulate. The word shag, in fact, comes anciently from shake. "Shook thy spear." Spear constantly used to mean a penis, and that has a rather disgusting meaning of, how can I put this politely? Can't. Okay, bad luck. Masturbate. But also, of course, I think Thomas Bancroft is using this very specifically here. "Shook thy spear." He's showing that verb and object, just like the writer Thomas Vickers in 1628 talks about a poet who takes a name from shaking and spear, i.e. the verb-object compound is very much a pseudonym for the poet. "Shook thy spear." It won't surprise you, because of course they're all obsessed with numbers, these people, that little bracket about that pseudonym is 17 letters long, and of course it appears on line 17. So once again, it's bringing us back to the 17th Earl of Oxford, just as he did in the previous reference, having Shakespeare on line 17. Okay, so I think we've got plenty of reason to see we're talking about a scandal, and I now want to go to 117. This little epigram here that is addressed to T.H.C.H. Esquire. This actually is pretty obviously the poet, Thomas Churchyard. And I think the reason why he's half hidden the name and put T.H.C.H. instead of Thomas Churchyard is because by saying Thomas Churchyard, it will ring an awful lot of bells concerning scandals and the Earl of Oxford. Thomas Churchyard was the Earl of Oxford's servant, and the Earl of Oxford put him up in lodgings in 1591 with a lot of other poets and retainers, I think including Thomas Nash, and said, "I will pay for your board and your lodgings and your wine and your food." But poor old Oxford, as we all know, ran desperately out of money. He went bankrupt and suddenly couldn't pay. It was only £25. And Churchyard himself was in trouble because he had no written contract. And so the landlady got on to him and said, "Look here, pay this money. And Thomas Churchyard, terrified of being done and thrown into prison, ran and took refuge in the porch of a church. This is called taking sanctuary, and it's done because it was always thought that the church courts, the Archdeacon's Court, was more lenient than the civil courts. And so Churchyard went and hid in a church to escape the debts. And I think you'll find in here a little reference to that. Thomas Churchyard, by the way, says on multiple occasions that he intends to dedicate his works as a poet to the Earl of Oxford, but he never does so. And I think one of the reasons is because he falls out with the Earl of Oxford over this particular scandal, which became very well known, and Thomas Nash wrote about it, and all the papers still exist concerning it. Okay, let's read this. To Thomas Churchyard, Esquire, your noble genius holds, as doth appear, the very shadows of the Muses dear, who with proud maintenance have leavened those, i.e. the Muses have caused those to rise, that scarce will give you thanks in humble prose, nor in high verse can do it. So the Muses have caused to rise certain poets, they've elevated them, and these poets are not praising Churchyard very well. Now we have this colon again, which means this that is about to follow has a relevance to it. So on a sink shines lovely Phoebus, though his object stink. Okay, well, so on a sink. If we look up the word sink in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find it means, and I quote, a place in which vice or corruption is rank or rampant, a collective mass of unsavoury or objectionable matters, a receptacle or gathering place of vice, corruption. If you look up object in the same dictionary, by the way, that which is presented to the senses. So what he's actually saying in this last little phrase, so on a sink shines lovely Phoebus, though his object stink, is that Phoebus is clearly one of those who has failed to praise Thomas Churchyard properly, but instead he is shining his rays, i.e. casting his attention, on areas of corruption, rank vice and unsavoury matters. And it is in this way, though his object stink, his object that which he presents to the senses, i.e. his poems that he is concentrating, are about this rubbish instead of being about Churchyard and his greatness as a poet. He's obviously referring here to Venus and Adonis, which deals with Oxford's dirty scandal, and you can learn about that if you look at my presentation called Adon's Flower, and of course the sonnets, which also deal with this scandal. So once again, I think we can see that Shakespeare is being connected to Phoebus, Apollo, and connected to scandals that we know to be scandals about Edward de Vere. Now, just this matter of the Muses, so you're clear about this, we're told that this writer who's failing to be polite about Thomas Churchyard is being elevated, leavened by the Muses, lifted up by the Muses. Well, anyone who was well read in those days will know that there was a certain poet going the rounds who it was said attracts so great a love of the Muses, according to Thomas Coriat, who has drunk deep draughts of the Muses, according to Gabriel Harvey, whose infancy from the beginning was ever sacred to the Muses, according to Angel Day, and who talks of his fame, his love, for which he doth bear the Heliconian imps, that's to say, the Muses, and they to him. Edmund Spenser there saying that the Muses bear love to him, and of course that him is Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. So when we're looking at that poem which says that that the Muses elevate him, and of course who do the Muses look up to? At the very highest they look up to Apollo. So everything here is pointing towards saying that we are talking here about Edward de Vere's scandal with Thomas Churchyard, which refers to Venus and Adonis and follows straight into the two epigrams about Shakespeare and his sugared dainties and his sexual scandal with Penelope Rich. We all remember that in Shakespeare's sonnets, he talks a lot about scandal. Many of you will know the reference that Alexander Grossart, the 19th century scholar, made to Edward de Vere in 1872 when he said, "An unlifted shadow somehow lies across his memory." Now, I never tire of showing you these quotes, but I really think they're important and they're not given enough space. If you read the sonnets, we hear of Shakespeare that his name received a brand. He's despised, shamed, and vile esteemed, in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. He has made himself a motley to the view. He feels all alone in an outcast state. And he suffers bewailed guilt because of a vulgar scandal stamped upon his brow. In fact, his name is so tarnished that he asks for it to be erased. If you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it. In me each part will be forgotten. After my death, forget me quite. No longer mourn me when I am dead. Do not so much as my poor name rehearse. I once gone to all the world must die. I put these up because they are extraordinarily important. Shakespeare is going on and on and on, saying my name must be buried. And why? Because it will tarnish future generations. Edward de Vere wrote a poem, one of the very rare poems published under his own name, well, let's say his initials. His good name being blemished, he bewaileth, signed E.O., Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford. He was very aware of the trouble of a bad name. And so was everybody. You can find hundreds of sermons like this one at that time, which talk of the greatest treasure that a man hath is his good name. Thou must care and take heed and provide for thy good name, for that will stick by the better than 1,000 rich and great treasures. Better is a good name than great riches. This is, of course, a biblical reference to the book of Proverbs, but the importance of a good name is very beaten into people of this age, and they believed it very strongly. Not only a good name for oneself, but if you do something wrong, you corrupt the name of your descendants, as Shakespeare says of Coriolanus, whose name remains to the ensuing age abhorred. Now, we've been looking at this scandal, which involves not one, not two, but 3 people, all of whom had children and grandchildren. Now, the scandal is, of course, that Henry Vere, Earl of Oxford, should be the legitimate child of the Earl of Oxford, not the illegitimate surrogated offspring of Penelope Rich and Lord Southampton. Now, if we look at their children and their grandchildren, you'll notice one thing about them. I haven't put every single one of them, but most of them are here. Well, for a start, they are all titled. And you'll notice that Edward de Vere's youngest daughter, the Countess of Montgomery, she was married to Lord Montgomery, who was Chancellor of the University of Oxford, and he was Chamberlain to the court, a very important man indeed, and he died in 1650. You'll notice Southampton's son there, Thomas, Earl of Southampton. He didn't die until 1667, and he was immensely distinguished. He was Lord High Treasurer of England, of whom Lord Clarendon wrote that he was a man of great and exemplary virtue and piety. He dies in 1667. If you look at the grandchildren, Edward de Vere's granddaughter, the Countess Carnarvon, she lives until 1694. Penelope Rich, his granddaughter, Viscountess Newhaven, lives until 1714. And Southampton's rather famous granddaughter, Lady Rachel Russell, she doesn't die until 1723. So you begin to see here that there's a century worth of very, very closely related people to these 3 who do not wish their name to be blemished by reminders of this scandal. Now, I've been asked on a number of occasions, it's very interesting, Alexander, what you're putting up here about this scandal, and it seems possibly true, but I cannot believe that the name Shakespeare needs to continue to be hidden on account of this scandal. It's only a surrogacy after all. But wait a minute, I'm now showing you. There's a woman in 1723 who does not want it to be said that her illustrious grandfather, Henry Rosalie, went to bed before he was married with a married woman, Penelope Rich. These people that you're looking at here, the children and grandchildren of these three people, represent the British establishment. And the British establishment does not want Edward de Vere to be recognised as Shakespeare, because the poems we've been looking at and all these things I've been showing on this channel point to the fact that Shakespeare is involved in a terrible sexual scandal involving these other three. I just give here a list of some of, not all, just some of the jobs that were held by these three people's children and grandchildren or their spouses. And look how important they are. They are the British establishment. Lord Great Chamberlain of England, Lord of Trade, Chancellor of the University, Lord High Chamberlain of the Household, High Treasurer of England, etc., etc., etc. So I hope now you can begin to understand why, after 1604, after the death of Oxford, and we're often told that the reason why Shakespeare isn't outed as Oxford is because it was considered a slightly vulgar thing for a nobleman to be writing poetry and plays, and that is totally true. But the question remains, why after 1604, when he's dead, can't we now come out of our closets and say, well, he's Shakespeare? Just as, for instance, after Sidney's death, we start saying, well, these poems are actually by Sidney, even though they weren't published under his name in their lifetimes. I hope now that I have answered this question for you, that the British establishment came together to stop the identification of Shakespeare with Edward de Vere, because as soon as you do that, you realise from the written literature about Shakespeare that there's a big scandal that he is involved with. And by the way, the lists I've given you here, they don't even involve, I've only shown the children and grandchildren and their spouses. I haven't even gone into nephews and nieces, which of course include the Cecils, the Earls of Salisbury, the Earls of Essex, the Earls of Exeter, the Earls of Lindsey. So really the connections that the three people had to the ensuing generations of the British establishment was enormous, and there was a massive pressure to keep the connection between Shakespeare and Edward de Vere severed as much as possible. And that, of course, explains lines like this, which otherwise have no meaning to the Stratfordianists, to Mr. William Shake-Spear. Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise. Yes, you must be silent in thy praise, because the whole of the British establishment will come down on you like a ton of bricks if you're not. Hope you've got it. Hope you've understood it. Please tell your friends, and please subscribe and tell them to subscribe, and onwards and upwards, and more is on its way. Thank you for watching.